New political leaders, so new political voices. In the 1840, the abolitionists decide they're going to try to win the legal way. They're going to kind of copy what the Americans had done 80 years before. Right? So there were the street gangs of the Liberty Boys and the Sons of Liberty, but there was John Adams and the others who were writing these documents, right? The Declaration of Rights and eventually the Declaration of Independence. And so they wanted to try to do it the legal way. So they began a series of political parties. And from 1840 to 1860, abolition parties will be in the mix. They'll change names 3 times. The first time it's called the Liberty Party. They'll do 3 elections. Then coming out of the war with Mexico in 1848, there'll be a new group called the Free Soil Party. F-R-E, so that the soil we took from Mexico should not have slavery, right? But by 1855 with Bleeding Kansas, they decided we needed a new name. And a group of people in the Midwest decided, you know what we should do? We need something that's a little more catchy, that's also got a historical bent. So they reached all the way back to Jefferson, which is kind of shocking since he was a slaveholder. They reached back to Jefferson, and they took the name of his political party, which was now dormant, the Republicans, and brought it back to say, we are the new abolition party. In 1856, they weren't even the third party. You know, people tell you don't vote third party. They're lying to you, by the way. The powers that be who have the monopoly don't want you to vote for a third party. They'll tell you third parties don't win. The current Republican Party was a third party. They weren't even a third party, they were a fifth party. Because you had 3 or 4 other parties who were considered more popular, and political scientists of the day would have said the next party to come into power probably would be this other anti-immigration party. So, but surprisingly, in 56, Republicans will win, or they'll come in second, I'm sorry, 56. And so now you have this kind of force of abolition, which to Southerners was the worst possible thing that could happen. Significant change in communicating, well, political writing. Uncle Tom's Cabin, when Lincoln met Stowe, he said, so you're the little lady who started this war. Her book was outselling the Bible, which didn't happen. It was that controversial, explosive, and kind of electrifying to read. A fictional, but based on true account story of what was going on in slavery. And in many cases, many people in the North simply would have looked at you and said, I had no idea. And this is, of course, what galvanizes them voting politically for the abolition parties. Changing communication is the emergence of the telegraph. Now, all of a sudden, within 24 hours, instead of Bleeding Kansas happening, and maybe a week later it gets to your newspaper, and then maybe a week later you read about it or hear about it at church, and then get mad, depending which side you're on, within 24 hours, 48 at the most, it was in everybody's newspaper. And all these events and decisions that were being made were happening at a faster pace, which then picked up the speed of how we kind of went down this process. Economic distress in 57, there's an economic panic. The explosive event, or I told you about, is Harper's Ferry, and then the execution. And both sides are galvanized. Both sides are, this is it. The philosophical divide is very clear at that moment. By 59 in his execution, there really is no way back. And Lincoln, like I told you with John Adams, was saying, I will be a moderate. And he said very openly, in fact, the shocking thing about Lincoln's election is that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Shows you something about the Republicans, which is a whole different conversation. Not a bad thing, but just for them to win, they realized we can't just be abolitionists. So we've got to let moderates in, like this guy Lincoln, who personally seemed to not like slavery, but politically was making no stances about abolition, and openly said, even as late as 63, if I can win the war and keep everybody enslaved in the South, I'm all for that. And then only later, well, late 62, I should say, after Antietam, does he change his tune, because he strategically sees if he shifts the war from Union to slavery, it helps his cause of ending the war. So he does that. So the fact that there's this election, a galvanized moment with Brown, both sides are frustrated. Okay, so this takes us to the last one before our own time. And that is the great power crisis. Now this is the trickiest one for us because we're closest to it. So again, we'll say what I said before. As a historian, we've now entered the part where I would suggest we're very close to modern events. Meaning I will tell you that there's a lot of I thinks and ... as best the evidence shows us. So again, I try really hard to take a very open-handed approach as opposed to a determinate, oh, this is it, I've told you, kind of thing when we get to modern kind of events, because the evidence, I would suggest, is still not fully in. This one's also complicated. When you say, what's the great crisis explosion? because you have both the domestic issue, which seems more familiar to the others, the Great Depression, and the crisis does not have to be war. Don't think of the American Revolution as a war. There was a war that went with it. I think the Civil War, you'd call that a war. But the first two are political debates, and then this one's an economic debate. So Strauss and Howe are really clear to show that the crisis we go to may not be war. Don't look for a firing on Fort Sumter kind of thing. When I've had this conversation with them, like, what are you expecting for people marching the street like they did in the Civil War? I don't know. I wouldn't say that. But the possibilities are bigger than that. So you have these two things here that kind of come into the mix. And of course, the Depression and the attack on Pearl Harbor are connected. They happen in this same window, and they become intertwined for us both in trying to understand things and considering, like, well, what is the Great Crisis, right? So this one you know very, very well. A lot more words, obviously. Short version is after World War I, which we thought was going to be a good thing, which spawns out of progressivism. It wasn't a good thing. It got really messy at the end. President Wilson actually has a stroke. Actually, his wife, Edith, technically was the first female president. People don't like to admit that. But she basically ruled in his stead for about 9 months till the next election. So you have no leadership with him having a stroke. Congress, again, was a poisoned atmosphere, particularly between him and the Republicans. He was a progressive, which is fine. Progressivism had led us into imperialism. There's a whole longer story there. I know that might have been throwing a little bit of a jolt to your system. But you look at our imperialism, it comes out of our viewpoint of progressivism, which progressivism at its root is, I'm somebody who's here to help you because you can't help yourself. There's a lot more to it than that. And it's all noble. It's always a noble thought. So I don't ever mean to impugn or suggest that it's somehow terrible people trying to sneakily harm somebody else. No, they're literally there saying, I want to help you. So we go into the Philippines, I want to help you. We go to Puerto Rico, I want to help you. We go to Cuba, I want to help you. Whether those people thought we were helping them is the other side of the story, right? The other part of the narrative. But the idea. And so in that progressivism, we go in to help, and Wilson made all these wonderful speeches in 1916. That, yes, it's a good thing we do this. By 1919, it was like you drunk sour milk, but you didn't know it until you swallowed it. And so there was this big backlash. We don't even sign his own treaty. We refuse to participate. The Senate does not engage. And we basically back out of this progressive mindset. At the same time, the government does these kind of overreaching things like prohibition, which may have come from a laudable point of view. Yeah, I think it does. But it was a complete overreach of a typical progressive mind. You can't figure out how to quit drinking. You can't solve yourself from beating your wife and abandoning your children. So we're going to take care of this problem all at once. We know best. And at the same time, in rejection of progressivism, there's a series of presidents and congresspeople who are elected, mostly the Republicans, who go back to a small government, hands-off kind of way. So you have both this kind of overreaching and at the same time kind of a, we're not going to tell you what to do. And that gets mixed into a growing economic crisis, where you have the beginnings of the Great Depression with economic maldistribution, where you have a tremendous gap between the upper 10, 20% and everybody else, which this weakens the capitalist concept because capitalism works like money spent is like oil in the engine. And if you know anything about engines, if you take oil out, the engine will seize, and then you'll crack the block. And once you do that, you've ruined the engine. But if you don't have enough money for enough people to be spending, then you don't have enough oil in the engine. And by the time we got to the 1920s, you'd have this major problem of our economic status. Adding into that was a rise of consumerism, which kind of played into this kind of frivolity of the Roaring '20s, which was centered on the beginnings of personal credit. Now, they don't have credit cards. It was typically called buying on margin or buying on installment plan, but it was still the same idea of people buying more than they actually have the money to do. And economically, that's bad, particularly if it gets way out of balance, and it did. Our retreating from foreign stage out of the war, we didn't go into full isolationism as it often is accused, but we certainly didn't have the standing to be the leader that we could have had we done something different in 1919. Opens the door for other forces. Now, I want to hesitate. I want to stop right there and quickly say I'm not suggesting that somehow we caused Hitler or we caused Mussolini or we caused Stalin. There's a tremendous amount of other factors going on. Make sure you got that part. But we certainly were in no position to try to counter their thoughts with either our diplomacy or some other kinds of means. And in the case of Japan, you can make an argument that what happens in December 1941 was the product of poor American decision-making the previous 50 years. Again, not trying to lay the blame at any one person to somehow suggest that we caused that. We weren't in the planes bombing our own ships and causing the deaths of those American sailors and air people. But at the same time, we're not in a position to try to mediate that in any way or be a counterbalance in the story. And then the unexpected decision. Basically, by the time you get to the mid-20s, most of Europe felt embarrassed about the Treaty of Versailles because it was so unfair and so harsh to Germany. And so we tried to fix it by offering them credit, which sounds great, but basically what it meant was we were paying Germany so Germany could pay England and France, so England and France could pay us. Even if that part did work, what it did was it tied them like a three-legged race to us. The last month, the young plane of 29, once we go down, that was in February, in October, when we go down, we're taking everybody with us. Now, surprisingly, 3 years later, Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany. Because he was elected, more than any other reason, because of economic chaos in Germany. That's the main reason. I know about all the other things, but the main reason he got, again, when society feels normal, safe, and regular, the extreme position sounds extreme. And they're not. And if you go back and look at the voting for the fascist party in the 20s, before the Depression, it's very low. Crazy people kind of voting for craziness. But the moment I feel like society's not working for me, it feels out of whack, my leader's not listening, it feels unhinged, and I don't feel like I have a positive future for my children, now the extreme, the radical, becomes palpable. And then you look at the election after the election returns after 29, skyrockets up. So, here we go. War starts the conflict, World War I. I'm going to cover that. Weak government leadership. Particularly when Hoover gets confronted with the Depression. Although, like I tell my students, Jesus could have been our president in 1929. He wouldn't solve that either. If FDR had been the president in 29 and Hoover had been the president in 32, we would laud Hoover today and we'd demonize FDR. Nobody was getting out of that mess. And they didn't really know what to hit them. It's October, November 29. All through 30, they don't really understand what's happening. Finally, about 31, they're starting to go, this is kind of bad. And they start taking baby steps to fix it. But they don't take enough baby steps, so you just arguably, and they made it worse with like they passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, thinking a tariff would protect American industries, but all it did was ruin our exports, as it always does. And then Hoover in particular just begins, there's all these things, these Hoovervilles, these were kind of like the tent cities that popped up. Hoover flags were when you would walk around with your pants hanging out. That was a Hoover flag. They're showing everybody, I got nothing because of Hoover. Again, I think unfairly attacking Hoover. A Hoover blanket was newspaper. There's several of these. People kind of joke about Hoover's name. But again, it shows the people feeling like the government's not. This is how FDR wins. FDR, and nothing that he does economically or governmentally solves the Great Depression. World War II solves the Great Depression. And then that's a whole different conversation. But what FDR does is he communicates very clearly, I hear you. I know you're in pain. Here's some money, here's a job, here's an opportunity. And even though it doesn't systemically fix the Great Depression, it solves individual pain, which is real pain for those individuals. And he deserves credit for that, obviously. Active opposition. By the time 31 rolls into 32, there are people, both farmers, the bonus army were World War I veterans. On the other side, particularly as you get closer to World War II, the American First Committee, largely just new political voices of just the progressive mindset that had emerged. The most explosive writing is obviously Hitler's Mein Kampf, which would not have been an issue in the United States, just to be clear. People did read it. Time magazine makes him Man of the Year. Germany's